India is the diabetes capital of the world. 101 million Indians have diabetes. Another 136 million are pre-diabetic. That's 237 million people, more than the entire population of Brazil, sitting somewhere on the road to a disease that will quietly and eventually damage their eyes, kidneys, nerves, and heart. And the villain everyone agrees on is ultra-processed food, maida, packaged junk, the chips, the cola, the instant noodles, the burgers and fries, the pasta. Every health influencer in the country is pointing at the same shelf in the supermarket and screaming, "This is what is killing you." Some have created an entire cottage industry blaming 1 milligram of maltodextrin and a few milligrams of sodium benzoate. There is just one problem with that story. Indians do not eat much ultra-processed food. The average Indian gets roughly 1/10 of their daily calories from ultra-processed food. The average American gets nearly 60%. The British, about 55%. We eat a fraction of the processed junk the West eats, 6 times less than an American. So here is a contradiction worth discussing. The countries drowning in processed food should be the sickest. Instead, India, which eats the least of it among major economies, is the one becoming diabetic faster than almost anyone. And doing it at lower body weights in people who look perfectly slim and healthy. The controversial suspect that everyone wants to arrest has an alibi. So, if it's not the packet of chips you eat once a week, or the acidity regulators, emulsifiers, preservatives, refined oils, and maida, what is it? I'm sorry to break it to you. It's the food you trust the most. The food nobody is willing to put on trial. The dal, the chawal, the roti, the sabji. The home-cooked meal your mother makes, that her mother made. We've been so busy blaming a villain we imported from the West that we never checked the one cooking in our own kitchen. At this point, some of you are probably annoyed. Are you kidding me? Are you blaming my mother's cooking? Ghar ka khana is delicious. It's made with love. It kept your family alive through wars, famines, and genuine poverty. Yes, all of that is true. But that is not the question. What's in question is whether that traditional thali, exactly as it is, suits the body you are living in today. Look at an ordinary Indian day, not a cheat day or the day of the office biryani and pizza treat. A good, virtuous, home-cooked day. Breakfast, idli, dosa, poha, 2 parathas, carbohydrates. Mid-morning, chai with sugar, maybe a biscuit. Sugar, carbohydrates. Lunch, a mountain of rice, a small katori of dal, sambar, 1 vegetable, mostly carbohydrates. Evening, chai again with a little something. Dinner, rice, roti, dal, sabji, carbohydrates. Add it up, and roughly 60 to 65% of your calories for the day came from refined carbohydrates. And only 10 to 12% came from protein. And this is the healthy version. No restaurant involved, no Swiggy, Zomato involved, no junk food anywhere in sight. The reason nobody talks about this is that it doesn't make for good content. You cannot sell a course or a supplement by telling people the problem is the white rice they've eaten 3 times a day, every day, since they were 4 years old. It's too familiar. It's too close. Blaming a faceless corporation that makes maida is easy. Blaming the steel plate your grandmother served you on feels like a betrayal. But the thing about daily habits, it doesn't need to be dramatic. A bowl of white rice does not spike your blood sugar the way cola might, but you eat it twice a day for 40 years. The cola is at best a one-time purchase. The rice is an auto-renewing subscription. And to understand why that plate ended up so lopsided and imbalanced, so heavy on refined grain and so light on protein, you have to stop believing the most comforting lie about Indian food, that it is ancient. We talk about the Indian thali like it descended fully formed from the Vedas. The truth is that the plate most urban Indians eat today, the one drowning in rice and wheat and short on pulses, let alone actual protein, is barely 2 or 3 generations old. It was not handed down by sages. It was shaped by a famine-era body, an exploitative global empire, and a government price list. Let me show you the 3 things that built it. First, The suspect everyone loves because it lets you off the hook entirely: genetics. And in the 1990s, a diabetes researcher in Pune named Chittaranjan Yagnik stood for a photo next to a British colleague of the same height and the exact same body mass index. That's just the height to weight ratio doctors use. Identical number on the scale, but when they scanned the two bodies, Yagnik carried more than double the body fat. This is the thin fat Indian phenotype. For any given weight, we Indians and Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Sri Lankans carry more fat, especially visceral fat, the dangerous kind wrapped around our organs, and less muscle than Europeans. Our bodies, shaped by thousands of years of famine, are built to store fat the instant food appears. The thrifty gene. It was a survival superpower when the next famine was always coming. So yes, you are genetically loaded for this. But this is where we cheat. That predisposition has been sitting in our DNA for 10,000 years. It cannot explain a crisis that exploded in the last 40. Your great-grandfather had the exact same thrifty genes and did not get diabetes at 38. The gun was always loaded. The question is, what recently pulled the trigger? And the trigger is not in your blood. It's on your plate. And it got there by accident. Before the British, Indian farmers grew an enormous variety of food. Millets, ragi, bajra, jowar, foxtail, dozens of pulses. These are protein-rich, fiber-rich, drought-hardy grains that fed this country for millennia. Then the British arrived. And when somebody says that sentence, usually nothing good happens afterwards. The British had a balance of payments problem. They were addicted to Chinese tea and running out of silver to pay for it. The solution, as normal people would imagine, involves maybe telling your people to drink less tea or maybe giving something useful that the Chinese wanted in exchange for tea. No, that is not how the British Empire behaved. Instead, they thought, opium, grow it in India, sell it into China, fix the trade deficit with someone else's addiction. So the colonial administration ran an opium monopoly and turned hundreds of thousands of acres of fertile land in Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh over to poppy. Shashi Tharoor cites the figure of around 400,000 acres of farmland given to opium, land that could have grown food for hungry Indians. You can watch my video on the dark history of this. Every acre of poppy was an acre not growing millets and pulses. Colonial revenue systems forced farmers to grow what the empire could sell, not what their families could eat. The diversity of the Indian grain basket started shrinking, and the protein-dense, fiber-dense crops were the first to go. The decline of the millet was just colonial policy. Then came independence, and a country that could not feed itself. India in the 1960s was one bad monsoon away from mass starvation. So the government did something rational and, for its time, heroic. To beat famine, it guaranteed farmers a minimum support price, the MSP, and built an entire procurement machine to buy their grain. But the MSP machine was built around two crops, wheat and rice. The government would buy unlimited quantities of wheat and rice at a guaranteed price. Pulses and oilseeds were technically on the list but barely procured in practice. So farmers did the only sensible thing. They grew the crop the government promised to buy. Rice and wheat flooded the country and became artificially cheap. Dal did not get the same support, so dal got relatively expensive. This worked. The famines stopped, and that is a genuine triumph. But it also rewired the national plate. It made refined carbohydrates the cheapest thing on your table and protein and resistant starch a relative luxury. Your grandmother did not serve a mountain of rice and watery dal because of ancient nutritional wisdom. She served it because that's what history and policy made cheap. Put all that together and you get a plate built for scarcity, stripped of its protein and fiber by an empire and a government price list. For most of history, that plate still worked. Because of one thing, the body eating it never stopped moving. A person 100 years ago walked everywhere, squatted to cook and clean and use the toilet, drew water, washed clothes by hand, and did physical labor from sunrise to sunset. They burned through 3,000 calories a day. A carb-heavy plate was fuel, and it got burned by nightfall. You and me maybe burn 1,800. We sit at a desk We commute in a car, and our evening cardio is reaching for the remote. The plate stayed exactly the same, your body's needs did not. So, the traditional Indian diet is not ancient wisdom. It is the residue of famine genetics, a colonial drug trade, and a 1965 price policy served onto a body that quit moving 50 years ago. And that is genuinely good news because it's hard to throw away ancient tradition. It's not hard to correct a colonial crime. Here is the second mistake we keep making. Having imported our villain from the West, we now try to import our cure from there too. Quinoa, kale, almond flour, blueberries, some powdered root with a Sanskrit sounding name and a 3,000 rupee price tag. You don't. The fix is the plate you already cook. Reproportioned. 4 dials. You don't crank them to the maximum. You nudge them and the whole thing tips back into balance. Start here because this is the dial India gets most catastrophically wrong. The average Indian eats 0.6 to 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Even the conservative requirement is around 1 gram per kilo. And if you are trying to hold muscle, closer to 1.6. We are running on roughly half of what we need as an entire civilization. Please watch all my videos on protein to understand this better. Protein matters for 2 reasons your body cares about. First, it's the most filling thing you can eat because it triggers a set of gut hormones called GLP-1, CCK, and PYY, the chemical messengers your intestine fires up to your brain to say, we're full now, stop eating. Carbohydrate barely whispers to them. Protein shouts. Second, protein is expensive for your body to even digest. You burn 20 to 30% of protein's calories just breaking it down against under 10% for carbs. Protein partly pays for itself on the way in. And an important reminder, the dal you're relying on is not the protein hero you think. Cooked dal has about 8 to 9 grams of protein per 100 grams, not the 25 you've seen quoted on some infographic. That bigger number is for raw dal before it drinks up all the water in the pot. Rice and roti contribute almost nothing. The fix is nothing exotic. Double the dal and halve the rice. Add paneer or tofu into the sabji. The cheapest complete protein in this country is still the egg. 6 to 7 rupees, 6 grams protein. 2 eggs a meal closes most of the gap. Curd, sprouts, soya, fish, chicken, mutton, pork, beef, if you eat it. That's all. This is the all-important number. A gram of fat carries 9 calories. A gram of protein or carbohydrate carries 4. Fat is more than twice as energy dense as anything else on your plate. So a small cut in fat is a large cut in calories with no change in how much food sits in front of you. Let me do a simple experiment to bring this to life. All Indian cooking begins with oil in a pan. I have 5 ways to get oil into a pan. A spray bottle, a lid with holes poked in it, a teaspoon, a tablespoon, and the classic Indian free pour straight from the bottle. The spray gives me about 1.5 grams, roughly 15 calories. The hold lid, if I'm being restrained, drops maybe half a teaspoon, which is 2 to 3 grams, about 25 calories. An actual measured teaspoon, 45 calories. A tablespoon triples that to 135 calories. But the free pour, the one where you tip the bottle and eyeball it the way your mother did, that casual 3-second glug dumps 30 to 35 grams into the pan. That's 270 to 315 calories of fat before any other ingredient has gone in. This is why I'm obsessed with the mechanics of how oil leaves the bottle. Your hand doesn't change. Your intention doesn't change. The only thing that changes is the delivery system. And that delivery system is the difference between a 200 calorie sabji and a 500 calorie one. If you cook 3 meals a day and free pour each time, you could be adding 600 invisible calories that taste like nothing, contribute no fullness, but can clog your arteries. To be clear, fat is not the enemy. Your brain is built with it. But the restaurant-style cooking we copy at home to feel fancy uses far more than the flavor needs. A dal makhani that's 850 calories is mostly butter and cream calories, not dal. In fact, you can use this simple rule of thumb. Any dish you order from Swiggy, Zomato, or at a restaurant will have 2.5 to 3 times more calories than the same dish at home. This dial is the one we engineered downward on purpose. We took a fiber-rich tradition and sanded it smooth. We polished brown rice into white. We refined whole wheat into maida, which is wheat with the fiber and bran stripped out. The ICMR, India's main medical research body, found that 62% of the calories Indians eat now come from refined carbohydrates. Fiber earns its place two ways. It slows how fast your stomach empties, so you can stay full for hours instead of hungry again by 11 a.m. And the fiber you cannot digest travels down to your gut bacteria, which ferment it into short-chain fatty acids, useful compounds that calm inflammation and help regulate appetite. The bacteria eat your leftovers and pay you back. This, at last, is where millets earn their reputation. And to be honest, millets are sometimes overhyped. Ragi, jowar, and bajra have roughly the same calories as rice. They're not magic and they're not a weight loss drug. What they are is whole grains that still have their fiber. Switch some meals to brown or hand-pounded rice, use whole wheat atta, rotate in millets, leave the skin on vegetables. Throw in some seeds like chia. Every time you choose the whole version over the refined one, you're putting back a fullness tool that a steam mill took out a century ago. The last dial is the carbs themselves. And here is the distinction. Not all carbohydrate behaves the same. Simple carbs, the white rice, the maida, the sugar in your chai, and your cold drink, break down into glucose almost instantly and dump it into your blood as a sharp spike. Your pancreas has to fire out a wave of insulin to clear it. Do that 3, 4, 5 times a day for decades in a body that's already insulin resistant by genetic default, and you wear the whole system out. That is the road to diabetes. I'm not saying do some stupid diet like keto. You don't have to fear carbohydrates. You have to stop letting the fastest spiking, most refined version of it dominate every single meal. I'm not saying eat millet biryani. Just use a smaller portion of rice, bulked out with dal and sabji so that the plate is not 70% grain. Whole grain over refined wherever you can. Whole dals over split dals wherever you can. And stop drinking your sugar. The chai, biscuit, cold drink habit is pure, simple carbohydrate with nothing to slow it down. Reproportion the plate so carbohydrate is part of the meal, not the entire meal. So let's line the suspects back up. Your genes had an alibi. They've been the same for 10,000 years and can't explain a crisis that's 40 years old. Processed food had an alibi too. You eat a sixth of what the West eats and you are sicker than they are. The real culprit was the food you trusted most, the home-cooked plate. But it did not act alone. It was framed by a famine-era body built to hoard fat, by an exploitative empire that traded your millets for opium, by a 1965 price policy that made rice cheap and dal expensive, and by a body that somewhere in the last 50 years simply stopped moving. None of that is your grandmother's fault. She cooked what scarcity and policy put within her reach for a family that walked 15 kilometers a day. The plate was not wrong. The diet was not wrong. The thali was not wrong. The world underneath it changed, and the recipe did not. Which means the answer was never in a foreign supermarket. You don't need quinoa or kale. You need to take the dal chawal you already love and reproportion it. More protein, less fat, more fiber, fewer simple carbs. Same amazing spices for the antioxidants. A rebalanced Indian plate beats a quinoa bowl every single time, and it costs less. Your traditional meal was never a sacred object frozen in time. Every generation before you rewrote it for the world they were handed. Doing the same thing now, adjusting your inheritance to fit the life you actually live, is not a betrayal of tradition. It's the most traditional thing you could possibly do.